In 1911, a talented artist painted what seemed to be a simple portrait of a beautiful woman. But when modern historians carefully restored this forgotten masterpiece, they discovered something in a tiny reflection that should never have existed. What they found didn't just rewrite the history of this painting, it revealed a terrifying truth that had been hidden for over a century. The portrait shows Lady Beatrice Ainsworth, a wealthy woman from London's high society. Painted during the height of the Edwardian era, the artwork captures every detail with stunning precision. Lady Beatrice sits elegantly in a richly decorated room, wearing a deep blue silk dress that matches her piercing eyes. Her pale hands rest gracefully in her lap, and she holds a small silver mirror that catches the light from a nearby window. For decades, the painting hung in a private collection, largely forgotten by the art world. The colors had grown dark and muddy under layers of old varnish and dust. Most experts who saw it considered it a decent but unremarkable example of early 20th century portraiture. That all changed when the prestigious Hamilton Institute acquired the piece for their collection of British art. Dr. Evelyn Reed, the Institute's lead art conservator, took on the restoration project. With 20 years of experience bringing old paintings back to life, Evelyn had seen her share of surprises hidden beneath centuries of grime, but nothing could have prepared her for what she would discover in Lady Beatrice's portrait. The restoration process began like any other. Evelyn and her team carefully tested small sections of the painting to determine the safest way to remove the old varnish. They used special solvents and tiny brushes to work away the yellowed coating that had dulled the original colors. Week by week, Lady Beatrice's true beauty began to emerge from the darkness. As the final layer of varnish came off, the painting transformed completely. Lady Beatrice's skin glowed with a porcelain-like radiance. Her blue dress revealed intricate embroidered details that had been invisible before. The rich burgundy wallpaper behind her showed delicate gold patterns. Every element of the composition sparkled with renewed life. The restoration took nearly 3 months to complete. Each day brought new discoveries as more of the original artwork was revealed. The artist's skill became more apparent with every layer removed. Even the smallest details, like the lace trim on Lady Beatrice's sleeves and the carved wooden frame of her chair, showed incredible craftsmanship. It was during the final cleaning that Evelyn noticed something odd about the silver mirror in Lady Beatrice's hand. Under the bright lights of the conservation lab, she could make out a faint reflection on its surface. This wasn't unusual. Many portrait artists included reflections in mirrors and other shiny objects to show off their technical skills, but as Evelyn looked closer, something didn't seem right about this particular reflection. She called her assistant over to take a look. Together, they studied the tiny mirror through powerful magnifying glasses. What they saw made both of them step back in shock. The reflection in the mirror didn't show what it should have. Instead of the artist's easel or the room where the painting was made, it showed something else entirely. There, captured in perfect detail, was the face of a man standing directly behind Lady Beatrice's left shoulder. But when they looked at the actual painting, no such figure existed anywhere in the composition. The reflected face was gaunt and hollow, with sunken cheeks and dark, penetrating eyes. The man's expression was one of hunger and malice. His thin lips were pulled back in what might have been a smile, but it looked more like a predator baring its teeth. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to be looking directly at Lady Beatrice with an intensity that made Evelyn's skin crawl. The figure's clothing appeared to be from an earlier time period, with a high collar and formal jacket that suggested wealth and status. His hair was dark and slicked back, revealing a high forehead marked by deep lines. There was something timeless and ancient about his appearance that made him seem out of place in the Edwardian setting. Evelyn immediately called in other experts to examine the painting. They used high-resolution digital scanners to capture every detail of the mirror's surface. The scans confirmed what Evelyn had seen with her own eyes. The reflected figure was definitely there, painted with the same careful technique as the rest of the portrait. Chemical analysis of the paint proved that the reflection was original to the artwork. It hadn't been added later by another hand or damaged by time and restoration attempts. The mysterious figure had been deliberately painted there by the original artist in 1911. But why would someone include such a disturbing detail in what was meant to be an elegant society portrait? This discovery launched Evelyn into a deep investigation of the painting's history. She started by researching Lady Beatrice Ainsworth herself. What she found painted a tragic picture that grew darker with each new piece of information. Lady Beatrice had been the youngest daughter of a wealthy industrial family. At 24, she was known throughout London society for her beauty and charm. She had recently become engaged to a prominent banker and seemed to have a bright future ahead of her. The portrait was commissioned to celebrate her upcoming wedding. Her family owned several textile mills in northern England and had made their fortune during the Industrial Revolution. Lady Beatrice was well educated and spoke 3 languages fluently. She was known for her charitable work with orphaned children and had planned to continue this work after her marriage. But Lady Beatrice never made it to the altar. Just 3 months after the portrait was completed, she died, suddenly in her family's country estate. The official cause of death was listed as a wasting illness, but the details were strangely vague. Family letters that Evelyn discovered in various archives told a more troubling story. In the weeks leading up to her death, Lady Beatrice had complained to friends and family about feeling constantly watched. She reported having terrible nightmares every night and claimed she could sense a malevolent presence in her room. Her health began to decline rapidly. She lost weight, her skin grew pale, and dark circles appeared under her eyes. Her sister wrote in a letter that Beatrice had become convinced someone was following her, even though no one else could see this mysterious figure. She refused to sleep alone and begged family members to stay with her through the night. In her final days, she was barely more than a shadow of her former self. The family doctor who attended her final illness wrote cryptically about symptoms that didn't match any known disease. Lady Beatrice seemed to be wasting away from some internal force rather than any physical ailment. Her appetite disappeared completely, and she complained constantly of feeling cold despite warm weather. The investigation then turned to the artist who had painted the portrait. His name was Julian Vance, a talented but relatively unknown painter who had been trying to establish himself in London's competitive art scene. The commission to paint Lady Beatrice should have been his big break into high society portraiture. Julian had studied at the Royal Academy and showed great promise as a portrait artist. His early works demonstrated remarkable skill in capturing not just physical likeness, but also the personality and spirit of his subjects. Several art critics had praised his ability to bring life to his paintings. But something went terribly wrong during the painting process. Records show that Julian completed the portrait and was paid for his work, but he never painted another picture. In fact, he seemed to vanish from London entirely just days after delivering the finished painting to Lady Beatrice's family. Evelyn spent months tracking down any information about Julian's disappearance. She searched through newspaper archives, gallery records, and personal correspondence from other artists of the period. Most trails led nowhere, but eventually she found a crucial lead in the basement of an old art supply shop. Hidden behind some dusty canvases, she discovered Julian's personal journal. The leather-bound book contained detailed entries about his work, including his thoughts and experiences while painting Lady Beatrice's portrait. What Evelyn read in those pages chilled her to the bone. Julian's early entries were full of excitement about the prestigious commission. He wrote about how honored he felt to be chosen for such an important project. He described Lady Beatrice as a perfect subject, with classical features that would translate beautifully to canvas. He noted her kindness and intelligence, mentioning how she would engage him in conversations about art and literature during their painting sessions. She seemed genuinely interested in his techniques and asked thoughtful questions about his artistic process. But as the weeks progressed, Julian's tone began to change. He started mentioning a strange coldness in the room where he worked, even during the warm summer months. He wrote about feeling like someone was watching him paint, though he and Lady Beatrice were supposedly alone during their sessions. The entries grew more disturbing as time went on. Julian described seeing movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that shouldn't have been there. He noticed that Lady Beatrice seemed to grow weaker with each painting session, though she never complained or asked to stop. Most unsettling of all, Julian wrote about glimpses of a figure standing behind Lady Beatrice. He could never see it clearly when he looked directly, but in quick glances and reflected surfaces, he caught sight of a tall, gaunt man who seemed to hover just over her shoulder. The final entries in Julian's journal were written in increasingly frantic handwriting. He described a growing sense of dread that made it difficult for him to sleep or eat. He became convinced that something evil was feeding on Lady Beatrice's life force, slowly draining her strength and vitality. In his last entry, Julian wrote about a moment of terrible clarity during their final painting session. As he worked on the details of the silver mirror in Lady Beatrice's hand, he saw the reflection clearly for just an instant. The gaunt figure was there, looking directly at him with eyes full of malice and hunger. Julian wrote that he painted exactly what he saw in that moment, hoping that someone in the future might understand the truth of what had happened. He believed that by capturing the entity's image, he had drawn its attention to himself. The journal ends with Julian's plans to flee London immediately, never to return to painting again. Back in the present day, strange things began happening at the Hamilton Institute. The first incidents were small. Staff members working late reported feeling like they were being watched. Security guards complained about cold spots in the building that hadn't been there before. The disturbances seemed to center around the conservation lab where Lady Beatrice's portrait was being studied. Motion sensors would trigger for no apparent reason during the night. Cleaning supplies and tools were found moved from their usual locations each morning. Electronic equipment began malfunctioning near the painting. Computers would shut down unexpectedly, and camera equipment produced strange distortions when pointed at the portrait. The building's heating system struggled to maintain normal temperatures in the lab area. Evelyn tried to dismiss these reports as coincidence or imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed since they had fully revealed the reflection in the mirror. The painted figure seemed somehow more vivid and detailed than it had been initially. One evening, Evelyn decided to work late to complete her analysis of the digital scans. The building was empty except for a single security guard making his rounds. The conservation lab was quiet and dimly lit, with only her desk lamp providing illumination. As she compared the high-resolution images of the mirror's reflection on her computer screen, Evelyn began to notice subtle details she had missed before. The reflected figure's clothing suggested he was from an earlier time period than 1911. His hair was longer and unkempt, and there was something primitive about his overall appearance. She leaned closer to the screen to examine the figure's face more carefully. The eyes were the most disturbing feature, completely black and seemingly bottomless. They held an intelligence that was both ancient and malevolent. As Evelyn studied the image, she became aware of an unusual chill in the air. The temperature in the lab seemed to drop several degrees, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. She looked up from her computer screen and found herself staring into her own reflection on the dark monitor. But her blood froze as she realized she wasn't alone in the reflection. Standing directly behind her, just as it had stood behind Lady Beatrice over a century ago, was the same gaunt figure from the painting. The entity's hollow eyes met hers in the reflection, and Evelyn felt a crushing wave of despair wash over her. She understood in that moment that the restoration process hadn't just uncovered an old secret. It had somehow reawakened something that should have remained hidden. She spun around quickly, but the lab behind her was empty. When she looked back at the computer screen, only her own frightened face stared back from the dark reflection. But she could still feel the presence lingering in the room, patient and hungry. The next morning, Evelyn made a decision that would end her career, but possibly save her life. She recommended that Lady Beatrice's portrait be removed from all public records and locked away in the Institute's deepest storage vault. The official story was that the restoration had revealed damage too extensive to repair, making the painting unsuitable for display. Only a handful of people knew the real reason why one of the most beautiful portraits ever painted would never be seen by the public again. Lady Beatrice's portrait now sits in a climate-controlled room far beneath the Hamilton Institute, surrounded by other artworks too dangerous or disturbing for public viewing. The room is kept locked at all times, and only the most senior staff members have access to the area. But Evelyn knows that locks and walls cannot contain what lives within that painted reflection. Sometimes, late at night in her own home, she catches glimpses of movement in mirrors and windows. She has learned to avoid looking too closely at any reflective surface after dark. The entity that once fed on Lady Beatrice's life has found someone new to watch, and Evelyn fears that her discovery of its existence has only made it stronger and more determined to claim another victim. How many other artworks hide similar secrets? How many portraits contain reflections that show things beyond our understanding? The next time you visit a museum or gallery, look carefully at the mirrors and windows in old paintings. You might see more than the artist intended to reveal. If you want to hear more stories about the dark secrets hidden in plain sight throughout history, make sure to subscribe to our channel. There are mysteries everywhere, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover the truth.